So yeah, by about the 10th century, within the tantric traditions, we see this notion of Kundalini rising up through the 6 chakras pretty well defined. But in those traditions, it seems pretty clear that these practices are primarily visualization based. Okay, so you're told, the verbs in the text say create, bhavayet, dhyayet, so kind of create this notion mentally for the chakras and Kundalini. I mean, it's the kind of ontological status of Kundalini is not clear, but seems to be primarily something that's mentally created. But then within the Hatha Yoga tradition, whose texts first start appearing 10th, 11th century, so probably a little bit later, when they first appear, actually Kundalini has no place in them. So 2 of the earliest texts of the Hatha Yoga tradition, the Amrita Siddhi and the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, so that the first one means something like the perfection of immortality, and the other one is the Yoga treatise according to Dattatreya. They teach this yogic physiology in which, and of course it's all male-oriented, as all these Sanskrit texts are. They're written by men, for men generally. They teach this yogic physiology in which there's a substance called Bindu in the brain or in the skull that's constantly dripping down, and it's either being burnt up by the fire in the stomach or ejaculated as semen. And the purpose of some of the techniques taught in these yoga texts is to stop that process. So the crudest perhaps is by doing a headstand, simply by inverting, and then gravity will stop that process. Because it's seen that the loss, this bindu, as it's called, is the essence of life within the body. So its loss leads to old age and death. So the yogi wants to reverse this or stop it. Now, then, subsequently, within a couple of hundred years, the earliest texts are quite obscure texts, like the Amaroga Prabodha, Viveka Martanda. Now, these are texts associated with the Paschimamnaya tradition that I mentioned earlier, which is the first tantric tradition to teach the notion of Kundalini. But it doesn't teach Hatha yogic practices. These are all, as I said earlier, visualization, meditational practices. A little bit of pranayama, but not really. Pretty much all meditation-based. So now we've got these early Hatha Yoga texts with physical methods of manipulating the vital energies in the body. And onto this paradigm gets overlaid this notion of Kundalini with the 6 chakras. And this creates some kind of ontological clashes, because these are things, to some extent, in the textual tradition at least, existing on different planes. But some texts also bring about quite a nice melding of the two. And so you'll see, we find in text, so for example, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, the mudras that it teaches for the manipulation of the breath and this bindu, this vital energy, are then taught verbatim. So you find exactly the same verses in later texts, such as the Shiva Samhita and the Hatha Pradipika, yet they're introduced with a passage saying these practices are for raising Kundalini, when there's no mention of Kundalini in the texts that first teach them. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily, that they're making this up, and this is they're being disingenuous to do this. I think within all mystical traditions, I'm not an expert on mystical traditions outside of India, but certainly within India, and for a long time predating the Hatha texts, the idea of mystical progress is often seen as an ascent up the central channel of the body. When the mystical experience is located within the body, that's how it's seen. And whether that's the breath or the bindu or kundalini, there are different ways of understanding this, different ways of framing it, but I think they're describing the same process.